Yet, according to a source with direct knowledge of the investigation, who agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity, the initial responding team made what this source called a rush to judgment. Despite the blood, despite the destroyed camera, despite the family's immediate insistence that Nancy could not have simply walked away, investigators latched onto a theory that Nancy had somehow wandered off. And once they committed to that theory, they ran the entire early investigation as if this were a search and rescue situation rather than a potential homicide. The source close to the investigation revealed that the homicide detectives who first arrived on scene did not have extensive experience in investigating homicides. Even more concerning, the supervisor overseeing the homicide unit at that time had never investigated a homicide before being installed in that supervisory position. Read that again. The person supervising the homicide investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had zero prior experience investigating homicides. When asked how such a situation was possible, the source indicated that decisions about who fills certain positions within the Pima County Sheriff's Department were sometimes based on relationships and favoritism rather than merit and qualifications. This lack of experience had immediate and potentially devastating consequences. When you treat a crime scene as a search location rather than the site of a violent crime, everything changes. If you're looking for someone who walked away from their house, you're going to organize searchers in a grid pattern around the property. You're going to have people walking through the yard, the driveway, flower beds, any area of dirt or soil near the home. You might even use that driveway as a staging area where everyone gathers for instructions before heading out to search. But every single one of those actions destroys potential evidence. Footprints that might have told investigators someone carried Nancy to a vehicle get trampled by dozens of search volunteers. Tire tracks that could have identified a specific car get driven over. Trace evidence, like fibers or hair, gets scattered or contaminated. The exterior of Nancy's home should have been treated as an active crime scene with restricted access and meticulous documentation. Instead, it became a hub of activity with people coming and going. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore, who has decades of experience in criminal investigations, explained the severity of this error. When you approach any scene where someone has gone missing under suspicious circumstances, you look at everything. You don't make assumptions. You gather evidence. The presence of blood alone should have immediately elevated this to a criminal investigation. The ripped Ring camera should have confirmed it beyond any doubt. Moore pointed out that, in his experience with the FBI, agents who made the best investigators were the ones who could admit when their initial theory was wrong. When evidence didn't fit their conclusions, they had the integrity and skill to change direction and follow where the evidence actually led. They didn't force the evidence to fit their preferred narrative. But according to the source, that's exactly what happened in the early hours of Nancy's disappearance. Investigators committed to the wandered off theory and stayed with it despite mounting evidence that contradicted it. Savannah Guthrie and Annie tried to tell investigators that Nancy physically could not have wandered away. They explained her mobility issues. They explained her mental clarity. They insisted something terrible had happened. And they were apparently ignored or dismissed. The mishandling didn't stop with the initial response. After processing the scene, investigators made a decision that Steve Moore called inconceivable. They released the crime scene. They took down the tape, removed any security presence, and allowed the property to return to normal access. This decision had cascading consequences that may have permanently compromised the investigation. Once a crime scene is released, its evidentiary value plummets. Any evidence discovered after that point becomes immediately questionable. Defense attorneys in any future prosecution could argue that evidence was planted during the time the scene was unsecured. How can you prove that a footprint found on the third visit to the property was there on day one? How can you be certain that any physical evidence collected later wasn't contaminated or introduced after the scene was opened? The source confirmed that investigators returned to Nancy's property not just once, but several times after the initial release. The FBI was brought in to assist, and they came back multiple times to process the scene. Moore noted that this pattern strongly suggests the initial evidence collection was inadequate. If investigators had properly secured and processed the scene the first time, there would be no need for repeated returns. The fact that the FBI kept coming back tells you that critical work was left undone in those crucial first hours. Media outlets, including the journalist who has been covering this case extensively, were able to walk right up to Nancy's property during the period when the scene had been released. Video footage shows blood still visible on the tile of the front step, evidence that should have been collected and secured immediately. Moore explains that FBI protocol in cases involving blood spatter would typically be to remove the entire tile intact and send it to the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Blood spatter analysis can reveal crucial information about what happened. Was the blood dropped from directly above, suggesting it fell vertically? Or does the pattern show an angle, indicating movement or force? Is it high-velocity spatter from an impact, medium velocity from a beating, or low velocity from dripping? These determinations require examining the actual physical evidence at a microscopic level. Photographs don't capture that level of detail. When you try to enlarge a photograph beyond a certain point, you just get pixels, not the actual microscopic characteristics that trained analysts need to see. But if that tile sat exposed to the elements for days while the scene was unsecured, and if people walked past it or near it during that time, the integrity of any analysis becomes questionable. Moore also mentioned that in cases where bedding or sheets might contain blood evidence, FBI protocol is often to send the entire item to Quantico for analysis. The source suggested that bedclothes and other materials from Nancy's home may not have been collected or sent for the level of forensic examination that should have been standard in a case like this. The question of what happened to the Ring camera footage is particularly haunting. Nancy had that camera installed specifically for security. It was monitoring her front door, the exact location where blood was found. If that camera was functioning before it was ripped down, it may have captured the last moments before Nancy disappeared. It may have recorded her attacker. It may have shown a vehicle, a face, a weapon, the critical evidence that could break this case wide open. But that camera was forcibly removed, and according to publicly available information, no footage from that device has been mentioned as part of the evidence in this case. Whether that means the footage was never recovered, was destroyed, or simply hasn't been discussed publicly, remains unclear. Steve Moore made an observation that cuts to the heart of this investigative failure. He said, and these are his words, "This isn't rocket science. There's blood, she's missing, and the Ring camera has been ripped off the wall. People don't walk away like that." It's a simple, devastating assessment. The evidence was obvious. The correct course of action was clear. And yet, according to multiple sources, investigators proceeded as if Nancy had simply wandered into the desert. The source close to the investigation expressed concern about whether the scene was under any surveillance during the period it was released. Were deputies posted to watch the property 24 hours a day? The answer appears to be no. The journalist covering the case noted that when visiting the property during this period, there was no deputy stationed outside, no visible security, nothing to prevent access. This means that anyone could have approached the property during that time. The chain of custody for any evidence is only as strong as your ability to account for every moment. If you can't definitively say that the property was secure between your first visit and your second visit, how can you testify in court that evidence found on the second visit was definitely there all along? According to the anonymous source, the current status of the investigation is bleak. After 61 days, there is no direct suspect. There is no name on the table. No one has been publicly identified as a person of interest. When asked if this was shocking, the source said no. It wasn't shocking, given how the investigation had been conducted from the start. The source offered two possible explanations for why no suspect has been identified. Either the person responsible is lucky as hell, and that luck simply hasn't run out yet, or the person is extremely cunning and covered their tracks so thoroughly that with the compromised evidence and mishandled crime scene, investigators may never be able to piece together what happened. That second possibility is the nightmare scenario. It means that mistakes made in the first hours and days, mistakes that were entirely preventable, may have given a violent criminal the ability to escape justice. It means that Nancy's family may never get answers. It means that someone who is capable of making an elderly woman disappear, leaving only blood and a torn security camera behind, is still out there. The source also spoke about the leadership crisis within the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Chris Nanos is the elected head of the department, and he has been the public face of this investigation. But according to the source, behind the scenes, morale within the department is at the lowest point this source has ever witnessed. The source described an atmosphere where everyone is walking on eggshells. When Nanos began doing press conferences and media interviews about the Nancy Guthrie case, deputies within the department were reportedly telling each other and anyone who would listen that he needed to stop talking. The phrase the source used was, "Shut your mouth, stop talking." The tension between Sheriff Nanos and his own deputies became impossible to ignore when the deputies' union held a vote of no confidence. Every single deputy who was part of the union voted that they have no confidence in Sheriff Chris Nanos' leadership. 100%. This wasn't a narrow majority or a contentious split. It was unanimous rejection of his leadership. And according to the source, this wasn't even the first no-confidence vote that deputies had taken against Nanos. The source indicated that, given everything that had been happening within the department, the vote should have come as no surprise to the sheriff. For the wider public, and for the nation watching this case unfold, that vote sent a clear message. The people who work most closely with this sheriff, the people who see his decisions and leadership every single day, have collectively stated they do not have confidence in him. The source described widespread embarrassment within the department over how Nanos has handled media interactions and public communications about the investigation. Yet Nanos has continued to stand by his decisions. Early in the case, during one press conference, he acknowledged that perhaps the crime scene should have been kept secured longer. It seemed like a moment of accountability, an admission that a mistake had been made. But in subsequent statements, he walked that back, saying he didn't believe any mistakes had been made, and that he stood by his investigators and their experience. When the journalist covering this case reached out to Sheriff Nanos for comment before running the interview with the anonymous source, Nanos was asked for a response to the allegations and offered an opportunity to participate in an interview. He declined. His office stated he was not doing interviews, though he had appeared on local news stations around the same time. He did not provide any specific response to the claims made by the source about inexperienced investigators, the mishandled crime scene, or the lack of a suspect after 2 months. The source wanted to make something very clear to Savannah Guthrie and to Nancy's family. Just because there is what the source termed incompetent leadership does not mean that the deputies and investigators working this case don't care. The source emphasized that the people within the department are completely with Savannah and her family. They want Nancy brought home safely. They want answers. They want justice. But they are working within a system that, according to this source, is being undermined by poor decision-making at the top. The source was asked what message they would send to Sheriff Nanos if they could speak freely without fear of retaliation. The response was direct. The source said Nanos has ruined what was a great department, but that it's still savable if he steps aside. The source called on him to step aside. Whether that will happen is another question entirely. Elected sheriffs hold their positions based on votes from the public, not performance reviews from their employees. Unless Nanos chooses to resign, or is removed through a recall process, or chooses not to seek re-election, he remains in charge, regardless of how his own deputies feel about his leadership. What makes this leadership crisis particularly tragic is the human cost. Nancy Guthrie is not a political talking point. She's not a case number. She's a real person, a mother, a sister, someone who had a Ring camera installed because she wanted to feel safe in her own home. She's someone with limited mobility who depended on her family and her community. And now, she's been gone for more than 2 months with no answers, no suspect, and an investigation that multiple sources describe as fundamentally compromised from the very beginning. Savannah Guthrie has had to watch as the people responsible for finding her mother made what appear to be basic, avoidable errors. She had to experience the frustration of telling investigators critical information about her mother's physical limitations and mental state, only to have that information seemingly ignored. She's had to see her mother's crime scene released and then reprocessed multiple times, knowing that each day that passed without proper security was a day that evidence could degrade or disappear. She's had to hear her local sheriff make public statements that don't align with what she knows happened, and then watch as he refused to acknowledge mistakes. Annie, Nancy's sister who discovered her missing, has had to live with the knowledge that she was right, that something terrible had happened, and that precious time was lost because investigators didn't listen. The community of Tucson has rallied around this family. Those thousands of signatures on the banner outside the television station represent thousands of people who know that what happened to Nancy matters, that her life matters, that finding out the truth matters. Steve Moore emphasized throughout his analysis that he is not painting the entire Pima County Sheriff's Department as a bad department. He stressed that one or two people making critical errors can damage the reputation of many good, dedicated professionals. The anonymous source echoed this sentiment. There are deputies and investigators within that department who are competent, experienced, and deeply committed to solving this case. But they are operating within constraints created by decisions they didn't make and can't undo. The question of whether this investigation can be salvaged at this point is difficult to answer. Moore noted that once a crime scene has been compromised, once that initial window of time has been mishandled, you can't get it back. You can bring in the FBI, you can bring in additional resources, you can reprocess the scene a dozen times, but you can never recreate the integrity of those first hours. Evidence that should have been collected pristine and under controlled conditions is now questionable. Timelines that should have been nailed down immediately are now fuzzy. Witness memories that should have been fresh are now 2 months old. However, cases have been solved with less. Dedicated investigators using every available resource can sometimes overcome initial setbacks. Advances in forensic technology mean that even compromised evidence can sometimes yield results. Witnesses can come forward. Tips can break cases open. Digital evidence, cell phone records, financial transactions, surveillance footage from neighboring properties or nearby businesses, all of these avenues can still be pursued. The question is whether those avenues were pursued aggressively in the beginning, or whether the wandered off theory led investigators to miss critical leads in those first days. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is the lack of a body. Nancy has been missing for 61 days, and there has been no discovery of remains, no additional crime scenes, no ransom demand. Nothing beyond that initial scene with blood and the destroyed camera. This suggests a level of planning or capability on the part of whoever is responsible. Moving a person, especially someone who may have been injured or incapacitated, requires logistics. It requires a vehicle, a destination, and enough time to avoid detection. The fact that this apparently happened without leaving a clear trail suggests either extreme luck, as the source mentioned, or careful planning. The possibility that this was a targeted crime rather than a random act is something investigators would need to consider. Did someone know Nancy? Did someone know her routines, her vulnerabilities, when she would be alone? The removal of the Ring camera suggests awareness that surveillance was present. That's not typically something a random, opportunistic criminal would know or think to do in the moment. That suggests premeditation, or at least enough presence of mind to eliminate evidence. If this was targeted, then investigators should have been looking very closely at anyone in Nancy's life, anyone who had access to her home, anyone who knew her schedule. If this was random, then the search widens considerably. But random crimes often leave more evidence because the perpetrator hasn't had time to plan every detail. The source indicated that people currently in the know on this investigation have said there is no direct suspect, no name on the table. This could mean several things. It could mean that everyone who has been looked at has been cleared through alibi or evidence. It could mean that there are persons of interest, but not enough evidence to elevate anyone to suspect status. It could mean that the investigation hasn't identified the right person yet. Without more transparency from the sheriff's department about the actual investigative steps being taken, the public and Nancy's family are left to wonder what, if anything, is actively happening. Sheriff Nanos has stated publicly that he stands by his investigation and his investigators. He has characterized his team as experienced. But the source's account directly contradicts this characterization, at least regarding the initial responding team. This discrepancy matters because it speaks to accountability. If mistakes were made, acknowledging them is the first step toward fixing them. If a crime scene was mishandled, admitting it allows for course correction, additional resources, outside expertise. But if leadership insists that everything was done correctly when evidence suggests otherwise, then there's no impetus for change, no reason to bring in help, no urgency to correct course. The no-confidence vote from the deputies' union is a remarkable event. Law enforcement agencies operate on a paramilitary structure with clear chains of command. Deputies are generally expected to follow orders and support their leadership publicly. For an entire union to vote unanimously that they have no confidence in their elected sheriff represents a breakdown in that structure. It means that whatever is happening within that department has become so problematic that deputies were willing to take the extraordinary step of publicly rebuking their leader. And for that vote to happen not once, but multiple times, suggests a pattern of issues, not an isolated incident. For Savannah and Annie and everyone who loves Nancy, the political and administrative drama within the sheriff's department is secondary to one question. Where is Nancy? What happened to her? Every day that passes without answers is another day of anguish. Families of missing persons often describe a unique kind of torment, not knowing whether to hope or grieve, unable to find closure, trapped in an endless loop of what-ifs and maybes. When you add to that anguish the knowledge that the investigation may have been compromised from the start, the pain becomes compounded by frustration and anger. This is part one of an ongoing examination of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and the investigation that followed. There is more to this story, more information that has come to light, and more questions that demand answers. If you want to stay informed about this case and others like it, where we dig deep into what really happened beyond the official statements and press releases, subscribe to Crime Case Analyst and make sure to like this video. We are committed to bringing you thorough, fact-based analysis that holds systems accountable and keeps victims and their families at the center of the story. Nancy Guthrie deserves justice, her family deserves answers, and the public deserves to know the truth about how this investigation has been handled. The evidence that should have been collected from Nancy Guthrie's home goes far beyond what was visible on the front doorstep. According to retired FBI agent Steve Moore, standard investigative protocol in a case like this would involve collecting bedding, sheets, and fabric items from throughout the home and sending them directly to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for microscopic analysis. The reasoning is straightforward but critical. Nancy was 85 years old with severe mobility limitations. If someone removed her from her home, they would have needed to physically assist her or carry her. That kind of contact creates opportunities for evidence transfer. A single hair falling from the perpetrator's head onto a bedspread, a fiber from their clothing brushing against a pillowcase, skin cells transferring to fabric during physical contact. These microscopic traces can be the difference between an unsolved disappearance and a prosecutable case. Moore explained that when you're helping or forcing an elderly person out of a bed, there's going to be contact, there's going to be touch, and touch leaves evidence. The question is whether investigators recognized this in the critical early hours and collected those items before the scene was compromised. Based on the information available and the statements from the source close to the investigation, there are serious questions about whether bedclothes and other fabric evidence were properly collected and submitted for the level of forensic examination that should have been standard procedure. If those items were left in place during the initial processing, and if the scene was then released and later reprocessed, any evidence found on subsequent visits becomes immediately questionable. A defense attorney could argue contamination. They could argue that evidence was introduced after the scene was opened. The integrity of the entire evidence chain depends on maintaining security from the first moment until the final piece is collected. The anonymous source confirmed what many observers had already suspected. After more than 2 months, investigators have no suspects. There is no direct suspect identified. There is no name on the table. No one has been publicly named as a person of interest. For a case where blood was found at the scene, where a security camera was forcibly removed, where an elderly woman with limited mobility vanished without a trace. The lack of a suspect after 61 days is stunning. When asked if this was surprising, Moore's response was telling. He said, "Not anymore." In the early days of Nancy's disappearance, Moore and other agents who were following the case would speculate among themselves about how quickly someone would be arrested. 24 hours, some would guess. 48 hours, others would say. None of them could understand what was making this case so difficult to solve. Moore compared it to something the Riddler would devise, a puzzle so complex that it defied normal investigative methods. But its conclusion now is simpler and more damning. The case was botched early on, and that initial failure has impacted everything that followed. Cases are sometimes made or broken by the thinnest of margins, the smallest pieces of evidence. Moore referenced the Lockerbie bombing investigation, where Pan Am Flight 103 was destroyed over Scotland by Libyan terrorists. That massive international case, involving hundreds of victims and global political implications, was ultimately solved because a line of police officers searching the Scottish countryside found a tiny circuit board fragment. From that single small piece of evidence, investigators were able to trace the bomb components back to Libya and eventually bring charges against specific individuals. That's how narrow the margin can be between solving a case and having it remain a mystery forever. If the evidentiary value of a crime scene is reduced by even 10% due to mishandling, that reduction might be the difference between identifying a suspect and never knowing who was responsible. When evidence collection is delayed by 3 or 4 days, some evidence may never be collected at all. It degrades, it's contaminated, it's lost. It's destroyed by weather or time or simple neglect. Moore used the analogy of the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the earth, and through a chain of atmospheric reactions, you end up with massive weather changes on the other side. You cannot predict or fully understand the ripple effects of a poorly initiated case. One missed piece of evidence in hour 1 could be the piece that would have led to a witness in hour 12, who would have provided information that identified a suspect in day 2, who would have been arrested before they had time to dispose of additional evidence. The cascade of consequences from early failures is impossible to fully measure, but it's absolutely real. The source close to the investigation offered 2 possible explanations for why no suspect has been identified, despite the serious nature of the crime and the time that has elapsed. Either the individuals responsible are, in the source's words, lucky as hell, or they are more cunning than what investigators have typically encountered in the past. This is a question worth examining. Is this a case of extraordinary luck, where a perpetrator committed a violent crime and has simply managed to avoid detection through fortunate circumstances? Or is this a case of careful planning and execution by someone sophisticated enough to cover their tracks even in the face of a full investigation? Moore was asked this exact question, and his response revealed the complexity of the situation. He noted that some aspects of the crime scene suggest poor planning or even incompetence on the part of the perpetrator. The detail Moore mentioned about branches being used to try to cover up the doorbell camera is particularly revealing. This is not the work of a criminal mastermind. This is someone making a crude attempt to disable surveillance. Similarly, other details of the crime that have not been made fully public apparently struck investigators as embarrassingly goofy, in Moore's words. These are not the hallmarks of a sophisticated operator. Yet, despite these apparent mistakes by the perpetrator, no arrest has been made. No suspect has been identified. How is that possible? Moore's assessment is that there may have been some well-planned aspects to the crime, but other elements were amateurish. The frustrating reality is that even an amateurish criminal can evade justice if the investigation is compromised from the beginning. Part of the perpetrator's luck, Moore explained, is that the case wasn't investigated properly right at the start. That initial mishandling slowed everything down, changed the course of the investigation, and potentially meant that critical evidence was never collected. So you have a situation where someone who may not be particularly sophisticated has nonetheless managed to avoid identification, not necessarily because of their brilliance, but because the system that should have caught them failed in those crucial first hours. This is perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the entire situation for Nancy's family and for the dedicated investigators who are now trying to work a case that was compromised before they ever got involved. If the initial response had been appropriate, if the scene had been treated as a homicide from the first moment, if experienced investigators had controlled the scene and collected evidence methodically and completely, there's a very real possibility that this case would have been solved within days. The perpetrator's mistakes would have been their undoing. But because of decisions made by people who are no longer directly working the case, those mistakes may never lead to an arrest. The journalist covering this case asked the anonymous source what message people within the department would want to convey to Savannah Guthrie. The response was important and revealing. The source emphasized that just because there are issues with leadership at the top does not mean the investigators and deputies working this case don't care. They are completely with Savannah and her family. They want Nancy brought home safely. They want answers. They want justice. The hard work being done by detectives and deputies should not be judged solely by the failures of those in command positions. This distinction matters because it speaks to the morale and motivation of the people actually doing the investigative work. Steve Moore was asked what it's like for investigators to work a case when they're unhappy with how their leadership has performed, especially when the victim and the victim's family deserve better. His response was candid. It is disturbing. Investigators lie awake at night. There are deputies and detectives within the Pima County Sheriff's Department who are agonizing over how this case has gone and how they are being portrayed publicly. Moore said he feels horrible for the Guthrie family because they deserve better than this. But he also feels horrible for the department, for the rank-and-file deputies and detectives who are being dragged through the mud for something that wasn't a departmental problem. This wasn't an infection throughout the entire agency. This was a problem higher up in the command structure. The dedicated professionals trying to solve this case are suffering reputational damage because of decisions they didn't make and couldn't control. Moore made a striking observation about Savannah Guthrie's approach to this nightmare situation. He said, and he acknowledged it might sound strange, but Savannah is the ideal victim relative in how she has handled her relationship with law enforcement. She expects excellence from the police. She holds them to high standards. But she has not publicly denigrated them for not having immediate success in the investigation. She understands what investigators are going through. She understands the effort being expended, and critically, she has not turned on them publicly. This approach, according to Moore, actually helps the investigation. It motivates investigators. Every time Savannah goes on television and describes the police as tireless, as working hard, as doing everything they can, it reinforces to those investigators that their efforts are recognized and appreciated. That makes them not want to go home at night until they've found the next piece of information. It drives them to keep pushing. Moore said Savannah couldn't do more to motivate law enforcement to do the right thing. And in her worst moments, in the absolute darkest time of her life, she is probably displaying the greatest strength she has ever had to summon. The word Savannah used to describe the investigators was indeed tireless, and that word choice matters. She's undoubtedly frustrated. Anyone in her position would be. But she has chosen not to air those frustrations publicly in a way that would demoralize or antagonize the people who represent her best hope of finding out what happened to her mother. This is a delicate balance. Moore has seen cases ruined by victim family members who bonded too closely with a police department that was doing the wrong thing, essentially enabling incompetence. He has also seen cases ruined by family members who were so frustrated by the lack of quick resolution that they sabotaged the investigation by publicly attacking law enforcement. The sweet spot, according to Moore, is exactly where Savannah has positioned herself. You can be frustrated, but you recognize the difficulties. You recognize how hard the good investigators are trying. You motivate them publicly. You express frustrations privately and selectively, knowing who to talk to and when. You move forward constructively. Moore believes Savannah is demonstrating how to deal with a situation like this, even though he hopes no one else ever has to face what she's facing. The strength and grace required to maintain that balance while your mother is missing and you know mistakes were made, is almost unimaginable. The source close to the investigation described morale within the sheriff's department as extremely low and used the word embarrassment to characterize how deputies feel about their department being on the national stage in connection with this case. The journalist asked Moore how that kind of atmosphere impacts an investigation, and Moore confirmed that it absolutely does have an impact. He recalled his own experience assisting on the Atlanta Olympic bombing investigation. The FBI initially focused on Richard Jewell, a security guard who had actually tried to help people, and who turned out to be completely innocent. The public humiliation of that mistake hurt the FBI for a long time. It was embarrassing. It made the agency look incompetent, and that kind of reputational damage affects the people working within that agency. Moore's advice to the officers and deputies dealing with the current situation in Pima County is to hang in there. Reputations change. Public perception shifts. This moment will not define you if you do not let it define you. Work hard. Be honorable. Do everything right from this point forward, and let the results speak for themselves. But yes, it is embarrassing, and it is painful to be part of an agency that is being criticized nationally, especially when you know that the criticism is deserved, but not because of anything you personally did wrong. The source mentioned those early press conferences that Sheriff Chris Nanos conducted, the ones where he made statements that were later contradicted or walked back. Behind the scenes, according to the source, deputies and investigators were pleading with him to stop talking. The phrase used was, "Shut your mouth, stop talking." Moore was asked why a sheriff wouldn't listen to that kind of feedback from his own people. Moore's response was simple. When a lot of people are telling you the same thing, you have a choice. You can decide that everyone is being disloyal and you're the only one who's right, or you can consider that they might have a point. The fact that Nanos apparently didn't adjust his approach, despite widespread internal feedback, suggests which choice he made. The source also described the current atmosphere within the department as everyone walking on eggshells. The journalist asked Moore whether you can have a successful investigation in that kind of environment. Moore's answer was direct. No, you absolutely cannot. You need open communication, trust, the ability to raise concerns and share information without fear of retaliation. Maybe there are changes that need to be made to create a better environment. But Moore pointed out something else significant. The very fact that a source from within the investigation was willing to speak to the media tells you how desperate and frustrated people inside that department have become. Police do not talk to the press. They do not trust the media. This is ingrained in law enforcement culture from the first day of training and reinforced through years of experience. The mentality is, we are the ones in blue, and the media are the ones trying to ruin our cases. For someone within law enforcement to come forward to a journalist and reveal problems with an ongoing investigation is extraordinary. It's almost a cry for help. Moore noted that many officers would consider talking to the media to be dishonorable, a violation of the code. So for someone to do it anyway, they must believe that staying silent would be even more dishonorable. They're risking their reputation and possibly their career because they believe the public and Nancy's family deserve to know the truth about how this investigation has been handled. Outside the KVOA television station in Tucson, where Savannah Guthrie once worked as a journalist before her career took her to the national stage, a large banner has become a focal point for community grief and hope. The banner simply says, "Bring her home," and features a photograph of Nancy. Surrounding that banner are thousands of signatures, messages from people across Tucson, and from visitors who have come from other cities and states. The messages are handwritten, personal, heartfelt. In the intense Arizona heat, flowers are placed at the site regularly, though they have to be removed and replaced frequently as they wilt in the sun. But the community keeps bringing them. They keep signing the banner. They keep writing messages. The messages themselves reveal the impact Nancy's disappearance has had on people who never met her. Prayers for Nancy, hope for a safe return. Mostly what God does is love us. We pray you come home soon. Someone named Helen wrote to Savannah directly. We love Tucson. We live here in hopes and prayers. Your prayers, Savannah Guthrie family, will be answered. Bring Nancy home. Another message reads, Thoughts and prayers to you and your family. Stay strong. We are with you. Simple words, but they represent real people taking time to express solidarity with a family in crisis. One message referenced the Today Show, the national morning program where Savannah has been a co-anchor for years. We love the Today Show. Bring Nancy home. We love Nancy. People who have watched Savannah on television for years, who have welcomed her into their homes every morning, are now trying to send strength and support back to her in her darkest hour. Thinking of you, hope, peace, and love. One particularly poignant message uses imagery from the Arizona desert landscape. The desert is calling for Nancy Guthrie's safe return. Each saguaro arm represents one of your loving children who wants you home. The fourth arm is the entire Tucson community praying for your safe return. The saguaro cactus is an iconic symbol of the Sonoran Desert, and the image of those tall cacti with their upraised arms standing as silent sentinels calling for Nancy's return is powerful. Another message simply says, Love and prayers, do not lose hope. People have signed from Phoenix, from cities across Arizona, and from other states entirely. Prayers from Phoenix, Arizona. Someone from Fernandina Beach, Florida traveled to Tucson or sent a message specifically to be added to this banner. Stay as safe as possible. We are so very sorry for all of you. Praying for a miracle. There are no words. Nancy, we all love you dearly. Please come home soon. May the Lord wrap his arms around you, keeping you safe. The messages continue, covering the available space on the banner. Sending prayers, strength, and hugs. Bring her home. Guthrie family, we are praying for you. Nancy has our hearts. The repetition of certain themes, prayers, hope, love, the plea to bring her home, creates a chorus of community support. These are not just platitudes. These are real expressions from real people who are genuinely moved by what has happened to Nancy and who want Savannah and the rest of the family to know they are not alone. At the end of the day, beneath all the discussion of investigative failures and departmental politics and evidence collection protocols, this is what matters. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. She is a mother. She is a grandmother. She is a friend. She is someone who lived in Tucson, who was part of this community, who mattered to people. She is 84 years old, and she has been missing for more than 2 months. Her disappearance is a mystery that has rocked her family, her friends, and complete strangers who have been following her story. The question of what happened to Nancy and where she is remains unanswered. The community response demonstrates that Nancy has not been forgotten. In a media environment where stories cycle quickly and public attention moves on to the next crisis, the people of Tucson and beyond have maintained their focus on Nancy. They keep adding signatures. They keep leaving flowers. They keep writing messages of hope. This sustained attention matters because it keeps pressure on investigators and officials. It reminds everyone involved that people are watching, people care, and people expect answers. For Savannah, seeing this outpouring must be simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because it demonstrates that her mother's life matters to others, that Nancy is valued beyond just her immediate family. Heartbreaking because each message is a reminder that Nancy is still missing, that there are still no answers, that the resolution everyone is praying for has not yet come. The investigation continues. The FBI remains involved. Detectives within the Pima County Sheriff's Department, despite the low morale and the embarrassment and the walking on eggshells atmosphere, are still working the case. They are still following leads, still processing evidence, still hoping for the breakthrough that will finally provide answers. Whether that breakthrough will come depends on many factors. It depends on whether critical evidence was preserved despite the early mishandling. It depends on whether witnesses come forward with information. It depends on whether forensic analysis of whatever evidence was collected yields actionable results. It depends on whether the perpetrator makes a mistake, or whether someone who knows something finally decides to speak. What is clear from the information provided by the anonymous source and the analysis from Steve Moore is that this case was compromised from the beginning. The decision to treat Nancy's disappearance as a search and rescue situation rather than a crime, the inexperience of the initial responding team, the release of the crime scene before adequate evidence collection, the failure to listen to family members who knew Nancy best. These were not minor procedural hiccups. These were fundamental failures that may have cost this case its best chance at a quick resolution. The ripple effects of those early decisions continue to impact the investigation more than 2 months later. The question now is whether this case can still be solved despite everything that has gone wrong. Moore's earlier comments about cases being made on the thinnest margins and the smallest pieces of evidence offer both hope and caution. Hope because it means that even with a compromised scene, even with mistakes made, it's still possible that some piece of evidence survived and can lead to answers. Caution because it also means that if critical evidence was lost or contaminated in those early hours, the case may never be solved, regardless of how hard investigators work now. There are still avenues that can be pursued. Digital evidence doesn't degrade the same way physical evidence does. Cell phone records showing who was in the area at the time of Nancy's disappearance can still be obtained and analyzed. Financial records that might show unusual transactions can be examined. Surveillance footage from businesses or homes near Nancy's property may not have been collected initially, but it might still exist. Traffic cameras, ATM cameras, security systems at nearby locations, all of these could potentially provide information. Witnesses who didn't come forward initially might still decide to share what they know, especially as the case maintains a high public profile. The FBI's continued involvement is significant. The FBI has resources and expertise that local departments cannot match. The FBI laboratory at Quantico can perform analyses that are simply not possible at the local level. FBI databases can cross-reference information from cases across the country. FBI agents can dedicate time and focus to a single case in ways that local detectives, who are juggling multiple investigations, sometimes cannot. The fact that the FBI has returned multiple times to reprocess Nancy's home suggests they are taking this case seriously and are willing to invest significant resources. But even unlimited resources cannot overcome certain fundamental problems. If the crime scene was contaminated by searchers in those first hours, if critical evidence was destroyed or lost, if the perpetrator had days of lead time to dispose of evidence or establish an alibi because investigators were focused on the wrong theory, these are problems that cannot be fixed retroactively. You cannot go back in time and secure the scene properly. You cannot recover evidence that was destroyed. You cannot recapture time that was lost. This is why the early response to a crime is so critical. This is why experience matters. This is why having a homicide supervisor who has actually investigated homicides before is important. These are not abstract bureaucratic considerations. These are practical realities that directly impact whether families get justice and whether dangerous criminals are removed from society. When you put someone in a supervisory position based on favoritism rather than qualifications, as the source alleged happened in this case, you are not just making a personnel decision. You are potentially impacting the outcome of every case that person supervises. The no-confidence vote against Sheriff Nanos is not just an internal political matter. It is a direct statement from the people who work most closely with him that they do not believe he is capable of leading the department effectively. That vote happened before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and according to the source, it wasn't even the first no-confidence vote. This means there was already a documented pattern of problems with Nanos' leadership. Nancy's case did not create the dysfunction within the Pima County Sheriff's Department. It exposed it and put it on a national stage. Whether Sheriff Nanos will face any consequences for how this case has been handled remains to be seen. He is an elected official, which means he serves at the pleasure of the voters, not at the discretion of his employees or even his superiors. Unless he is recalled through a special election, chooses to resign, or is defeated in the next regular election, he remains in his position. His decision to not provide comment to the journalist who interviewed the anonymous source while simultaneously continuing to do interviews with local media outlets, suggests a selective approach to accountability. He is willing to speak when he controls the narrative, but not willing to answer specific questions about the allegations being made. For Nancy's family, all of this institutional drama is secondary to one overwhelming need. They need to know what happened to Nancy. They need to know where she is. They need, if the worst has happened, to be able to bring her home and lay her to rest with dignity. They need, if there is any chance she is still alive, for every possible resource to be deployed to find her. And they need to know that the person or people responsible will be held accountable. Every day that passes without those answers is another day of anguish. The messages on the banner outside KVOA speak to the community's understanding of that anguish.
Bring her home is not just a slogan. It is a plea. It is a prayer. It is an expression of the most basic hope that Nancy's family holds. Whatever has happened, wherever Nancy is, the family deserves to have her home. The community of Tucson, the viewers of the Today Show across the country, the thousands of people who have signed that banner or followed this case, they all join in that plea. Bring Nancy home. This is Crime Case Analyst, and we will continue following Nancy Guthrie's case. We will continue examining how this investigation has been handled and holding those responsible accountable for their decisions. We will continue giving voice to the sources who have the courage to come forward and tell the truth about what is happening behind the scenes. And most importantly, we will continue keeping Nancy's story in the public eye, ensuring that she is not forgotten, that her family's pain is not ignored, and that the search for answers continues. If you want to stay informed about this case and others where we provide in-depth analysis beyond the headlines, please subscribe to Crime Case Analyst and like this video. Nancy Guthrie deserves justice, her family deserves answers, and we will not stop covering this story until they get both.